We're going back to school, and today I'll be your teacher. Hey everyone, I'm Sigi, and I love all things Pu'er. Today, I'm here to bring to you the start of a new video series that I'm going to be doing on the nannuoshan YouTube channel. In this series, I'm going to explain some Chinese terminology related to Pu'er tea. As such, this video series will be called the Pu'er Tea Lexicon. My motivation for making these videos is some recent research I've done on how Chinese-speaking tea drinkers talk about Pu'er tea. Now, this kind of research doesn't just involve vocabulary, but to properly understand these words, you also have to understand when it's appropriate to use them, as well as their sort of historical and cultural context. As such, this research is closer to the field of anthropology than it is to just language learning. Now, my method for this research was that first I went and looked at Chinese online articles, basically extracted some vocabulary from there. Then I also looked at Chinese language tea books and some online tea forums. After doing that and sort of compiling preliminary lists of words and kind of the baseline meanings I've gained from that, I started talking to some friends of mine. These are Pu'er drinkers in China and in Taiwan, and some Western tea drinkers who are fluent in Chinese that are also more involved in those circles. In addition to that, I also talked to some Chinese friends of mine that are not tea drinkers, but are instead interested in the kind of connections between language, history, and culture. With those friends, I talked more about the, let's say, somewhat abstracted from tea meanings of these words, how they're used in everyday language, and the kind of context these words exist in. The connotations, if you will. All of this, as you might be able to imagine, is a somewhat lengthy process, so there's not going to be an exact schedule for these videos. However, we will try to post videos in the series fairly regularly, ideally about one each month. Some of these videos may be longer, some are going to be shorter. It's always going to depend on which terminology I'm introducing and how much sort of explanation it requires. All right. Now, before I introduce you to some of the basic underlying concepts that tie all of this terminology together, let me just say that if you're new to Pu'er tea in general and you're not quite sure what all the fuss is about, then we have a link here on the screen that will take you to the nannuoshan Pu'er tea collection. You can use this as a starting point if you want to join me in going down this rabbit hole. All right. So, since this video is meant to serve as a foreword, like the idea came from quite literally the foreword to a book where sort of the general ideas presented in the book are going to be explained, we have some fundamental concepts to highlight before we really get into the terminology in future videos. The first concept I'd like to introduce is something I've called static versus motion. By this, I mean that while a lot of the ways we commonly use to see tea being described in English makes use of sort of static terms or descriptions of specific moments during tea drinking, like we smell the tea and then we describe what the tea smells like in that moment, the same with taste and mouthfeel. The ways people describe tea in Chinese is often much more about motion and change. This refers to both characteristics of the tea itself, but also things like how a tea has developed in storage. One example to mention here that some of you may already be familiar with is huigan, the what's commonly translated as returning sweetness, where you don't just describe, let's say, a sweet aftertaste, but the important aspect of it is that it transforms. It goes from one place to another place, and neither of those specific places is called huigan, but the motion that takes place in between. This will also be explained in a dedicated video. Like, you can expect that there's going to be a video specifically talking about huigan and how it's understood at some point. All right. The next concept I'd like to mention is what I call interconnectedness. Many of these concepts I'm going to introduce don't just stand by themselves, but they spin a web and connect to other concepts in many, many ways. Think of the structure of this terminology not like a tree, but more like the mycelium of a mushroom colony. Those of you who are familiar with philosophy may recognize this kind of structure as a rhizome. And those of you with an interest in sociology, or specifically systems theory, can think of these terms as being connected and organized in a similar way to Niklas Luhmann's Zettelkasten. All right, time to switch to the second paper here. The third concept I'd like to highlight is the plurality of perspectives. As most of us in the West are purely consumers of pu'er tea, there is a certain degree of separation between us and what goes into the tea, so to speak. Because of this, the way we experience pu'er tea here becomes more unitary. As our experiences are filtered through the lens of consumption, the resulting perspectives have a tendency to be articulated and structured in a very unified and common way. We are made to pay attention to specific aspects that are highlighted either by the people that curate the teas that are sold here, or the aspects other local tea drinkers or tea drinkers in our online communities speak about. However, in China, different people are involved with pu'er tea at every single one of its stages, from harvesting to processing to trade, storage, and also consumption at the end, creating a plurality of perspectives that shape the discussion and culture surrounding pu'er tea. As a result of this plurality, sorry, I really struggle with that word, you often see the pu'er tea experience described with the idiom yin ren yi, something like it varies from person to person. In addition to that, pu'er tea is a cultural object, and not just one object with one specific cultural connotation, but it's an object that is deeply intertwined with a variety of local and regional cultures. The way a person interacts with and understands pu'er tea is completely different between the tea farmer in Yunnan, the tea trader in Guangdong, the tea drinker in Shanghai, and the tea drinker in Hong Kong. And it's possible that the exact same tea material may pass through the hands of all of these people at various points in time. But the way they experience it and integrate it into their life world won't be the same. This aspect is particularly well highlighted in Jin Hong Zhang's Pu'er Tea, Ancient Caravans and Urban Chic, where she describes her participation in events and on platforms where these different perspectives come together and exchange their ideas. Finally, there's one more concept to talk about. Similar to how every person's experience is different, not every concept I'm going to introduce applies to every tea. fresh tea, aged tea, and fermented tea are all different from each other. And the terminology that's used to describe each one of those will also differ to some extent. Many drinkers even state that, for example, factory tea and old tree tea shouldn't be measured in the same way, and as such, shouldn't be talked about in the same way. Alright, with all of these concepts taken care of, I will leave you with a little bit of recommended preliminary reading before we get into the terminology part of the whole series. First off, browse around on Babblecarb. Those of you who are not familiar with the site, it's basically an online dictionary specifically for tea-related terminology in Chinese that also provides explanations in English for what all of these words mean. Here are 3 words to get you started with that will also come up in the context of these videos: Shaqing, Ronyan, and Ganzhao. We'll have these show up here in the video so you can type them into Babblecarb and find what you need. Secondly, make sure to revise the steps for Pu'er processing. To do this, head on over to the nannuoshan Pu'er collection again, scroll all the way to the bottom, and there you will find a short outline of the various processing steps that go into making Pu'er tea. Finally, if you want to do a little more reading, read through Ancient Caravans and Urban Chic while thinking about the concepts I presented in this video to get an outline, an idea of the world we're about to enter here. Now, with all that, I hope you'll be interested in learning about some Chinese Pu'er tea terminology. I hope that you will find some concepts that you'll be able to apply to your own tea drinking. And I will see you in the next video with some actual terminology and not just this kind of introduction. Goodbye.